Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this session today. So today we are looking at covering, uh, employment law, and this is quite an important unit for those who are working and running their own businesses, who are looking at running their own business as a self-employed individual or essentially work within an organization in the HR, and people who are generally involved in legal services and do provide consultancy and obviously advice, support and guidance, in matters related to employment law. Now, this particular unit that you see on your screen is predominantly, going to be focused on employment law related to United Kingdom. And in general, this unit has, four learning outcomes that we're going to be looking at covering. We're going to be looking at starting with the first one today, which primarily focuses on, understanding different types of employment statuses. Now, this is a level 3 unit, although for people who are looking at progressing into law would also study this unit at level 4, maybe at level 5 or higher levels, essentially. But the detailing would go into, or obviously the content and the details would increase or become more in depth as you start to develop, various, I would say, one, obviously looking at developing working knowledge, and the second is obviously looking at relating it to a particular discipline, profession, or a particular sector. So this particular unit at level 3 is primarily focused on giving you an introduction to employment law. And we're going to be looking at covering learning outcome 1 today, which is, as I mentioned, different types of employment status. The second learning outcome focuses on laws relating to contract. So how are contract forms? What does the contract include? What are the terms and conditions that you need to have essentially included in the contract? What are the laws and legislation that the contract needs to adhere to? And obviously duties of the employer and duties of employee. The third one would focus on understanding laws related to equality and diversity and discrimination. So some of the basic acts which are required to be followed by employers when drafting employment contracts or agreements typically include, things like Health and Safety, Equality Act, Diversity Act, Discrimination Act. You'd also look at Data Protection Act. So some of these acts that are useful primarily to ensure that you are a employer. When sometimes you get to see adverts, you would say we are an equal opportunity employer. That means you're not looking at discriminating people on the basis of people's background, culture, their sex, their opinions, and obviously where they come from in terms of their background. So that, in terms of dealing with and understanding, would be covered in learning outcome 3. In learning outcome 4, we are looking at understanding how employment can be terminated. So obviously, as a part of the contract, in order to go the full circle, what we'll also be looking at studying is understanding, obviously, when you take on employees in different shape or formats, for example, temporary employees, apprenticeships, self-employed, zero-hour contracts, or things like that, in terms of full-time employees, there should also be in order to obviously understand this thoroughly and go the full circle, what we'll also be looking at understanding is how employment contracts are terminated, what consists of unfair dismissal. There are some key terms that we will be looking at, things like, a dismissal policy. Sometimes you look at termination policy, you look at end of contract. So for example, if you're employed people, for a particular project or for a particular time frame on a specific type of contract, then when they do come to an end and the deliverables from the employer and the employee side would be discussed before the contract is terminated or contract is closed. So things that relate to when you are ending employment, or you are looking at dismissing somebody, or you're looking at firing somebody, as we normally say, or making employees redundant within the organization, we will be looking at how employment contracts are terminated. And in that particular context, we will also be looking at things like terms which are typically used in the contract, things like dismissal, unfair dismissal, what constitutes a wrongful unfair dismissal, what are the remedies for a dismissal if you do feel as an employee that your contract has been terminated unjustly, untimely, or without giving you prior notice. Then you can also represent and take this to ACAS, which is which is a particular body, which looks after, representation with employers. And we'll be looking at, obviously dealing with understanding, the requirements, of how you can go to the employment tribunal, and in general, look at taking help from the arbitration service, which is ECAS, as we call it, Advisory, Conciliation, and Arbitration Service. And they would then represent your case against the employer in the tribunal and obviously get you a fair proceeding. So those are bits that we'll be looking at covering, in the Learning Outcome 4. Now, that hopefully gives you a bit of an overview in terms of what is expected to be covered in this particular unit. Today's focus is primarily going to be looking at understanding some of the basic terms and terminology related to employment law, and obviously different types of employment statuses that we have specifically, I would say, in the United Kingdom, but some of these might also be true for other countries or other places, depending on the jurisdiction and obviously the law and legislation within that country. Now, the main aim of this unit is to look at introducing the basic terminology of employment law, laws related to employment, self-employment, and workers, and in general, how contracts for employment are made, what are the employees' rights and responsibilities, what are the employers' rights and responsibilities. And in general, the unit will focus on laws which are related to contract law, employment law, or laws and legislation related to when employment is offered to people working for or within an organization. Now, this first learning outcome has 4 assessment criteria. Most of the unit, as you would see, is looking at understand. That means this is a theoretical unit. There is no practical application required in terms of either creating a contract or drafting a contract or an employment contract. It is mostly going to be related to building your knowledge and understanding in terms of what employment law is and how does it work within a particular context. So all the learning outcomes, the key word is understand. It is not be able to, or for you to be able to practice or bring out practical applications. Obviously, during our discussions of this particular unit, we are going to be focused on understanding some of the key terms, terminology, concepts, with the help of examples that I'll bring out during our discussions in the presentation. And hopefully that will give you enough knowledge and idea about each of the assessment criteria that is required to be covered. Now, in the first learning outcome, we are looking at terminology like defining employees, defining workers, defining self-employed people, and then what are the differences between being employed and being self-employed. And in these contexts, when we look at these 4 assessment criteria, we're going to be looking at covering, things related to employment law, understanding judicial and administrative structure. We'll be looking at some of the acts which relate to some of these definitions in relation to the assessment criteria. And then we'll be looking at covering the wide range of indicative content which has been given here, things like the working time directive, what is the minimum wage in the UK, the agency regulation, workers regulation of 2010, what is an IR35 form, bits and pieces related to some of the cases which have been instrumental in helping shape up and obviously update employment law, within the United Kingdom. They would be covered. And obviously we'll be looking at certain terminologies, things like who are independent contractors, what are the tax obligations from a point of view of an employer and also for employees. And in some cases, what constitutes the breach of contract. And then this will also involve looking at getting into detailings of things like picking up a sector, picking up an organization, and talking about, what are the duties of employee and what are the duties of employer, and what constitutes a breach, and what are the various ways in which some of these conflicts or issues which arise, can be resolved, and in the context of, employment and employment related area, which is employment law. Now, I myself, just to give you a background, I have a master's in law, in commercial and business law, and have been teaching law, for roughly over 7 years. So I have a very detailed knowledge about employment law, specifically within the UK and in the context of European Union, and in the case of Indian subcontinent. So if you do have any questions related to what we are going to be covering, specifically related to employment law, feel free to ask me during the course of our discussions, and you can ask them through the chat route or even email us those questions so I can provide additional material or additional reading material for you to be able to crystallize and obviously understand that concept or question that you have. So let's begin this particular unit by going into a bit of a presentation. which would essentially allow us to discuss some of the assessment criteria which have been provided in Learning Outcome 1. Now, as I mentioned, the unit aim, this primarily is a knowledge-based unit. So you're looking at understanding the key areas and, terminology related to employment law, and obviously the different types of employment status or, different types of employment contracts which can be formed as far as the context in the United Kingdom in general is concerned. We'll also be looking at majorly covering the roles and responsibilities of employers and employees, and also look at in detail some of the acts and legislations which are, bits and pieces that you need to be aware of if you work, as I mentioned to you, within HR, look at firming legal services or any sort of legal profession if you work. And obviously provide consultancy in the case of employment law. Now, obviously, as a student who's looking at studying towards an LLB or masters in law, so this is a very important unit, and in most contexts, having good knowledge of this unit would also help you to understand what are the various types of employment types, and obviously contracts which can be formed when you take on employees or when you work with different employees within the organization. Now, let's start off with some basic terminology. The reason I start this off with the basic terminology is that we want to be able to look at, basis of what are the key terms when we do talk about, employment and employability. Now, one of the things that I would want to mention specifically in context to, the unit is a question that you should be asking yourself, because when we are looking at studying employment law, what we need to be able to do is understand what is employment law in general, what is the definition of this particular term, employment law, and how do we address and get a very macro understanding of why it is required. So employment law is nothing but, I would say, policies, processes, which basically act as information to address employment law issues at work. And this could also involve recruitment and obviously terms and conditions related to certain types of, let's say, employments and contracts which are formed up between a government, between two parties. I'll put it this way. But this would also cover, key concepts like maternity, paternity leave, to pay, as we call it, and also look at redundancy. So I don't know how many of you have heard about the term, TUPE, TUPE, but TUPE essentially stands for Transfer of Undertakings of Protection of Employment. So this was a set of regulations that was introduced in that basically protect the employee rights when their businesses transfer to a new ownership or a new owner. So for example, when you have mergers and acquisition, when you have companies being bought over by other organizations, when you have two organizations merging, then obviously the rights and responsibilities of the employees within those organizations are protected under what is called TUPE, or which stands for Transfer of Undertakings, essentially as a terminology. And this was introduced sometime in 2006 within the Companies Act, and is under Section 246, which basically in the UK is a law, and it protects the employees' rights when a part of the business they work in is actually sold or transferred or taken over by another business. So these are the basic bits that we need to have a good understanding of when we do talk about, employment law in general. Now, employment law is quite a vast field. It is a field wherein people can do specialization. And obviously, if you say I'm a lawyer or I'm a solicitor, essentially you could specialize just in employment law. And in such cases, you would be going into the minutest detail of this particular unit, although the contents of it might slightly vary, but pretty much overall will remain the same. Now, employment law also looks at regulating the relationship, between the employer and the employee, and it governs how employers can actually, or how it governs essentially, I would put it this way, how employers actually govern employees and what employers can ask employees to do and vice versa in terms of their right to work. Now, the employment law, obviously in the UK is a legislation, it's an act, and obviously it covers a lot of things with relates to, other laws as well in terms of age discrimination, equality and diversity discrimination, data protection, GDPR in general, as we call it. So there are lots. And then in addition to this, as I mentioned, maternity, redundancy, which are key aspects of this, which are also dealt with under the employment law. Now, there are a number of case studies and a number of articles that you can read in journal to get more information about employment law. And there are lots of specialist agencies in particular, within the UK, which essentially specialize in providing HR services related to employment law within the UK. Some of them are quite big firms which specialize, in the UK in terms of providing these services to small businesses or organizations. One of them tends to be, say, Bright HR. You must have come across this company. You look at Citation HR, which is obviously an online-based thing, and then you look at Peninsula HR, which is obviously quite a large firm based out of Manchester, and they essentially provide a lot of employment law related services to businesses and organizations of various shapes and sizes in terms of scale across the UK. These HR firms essentially use and are specialist in employment law, and obviously they refer to and provide these services to companies which have a range of functions in human resources or HR, and they relate to things like recruitment, employee onboarding, payroll, processing. You look at benefits, perks, performance management, employee relations, training and development, and then obviously looking at compliance related support so that your organization has the contracts, the paperwork which is up to date with regards to the government legislation and changes which are introduced from time to time. So it's a quite a vast field, but essentially looking at towards the key services that I would say terminology that we want to focus on in terms of services which are covered under the employment law, specifically for learning outcome one. We'll be today discussing, our discussion today will be focused on understanding the different types of employment status. Now, when we look at different types of employment status, there are 3 or 4 which come to our mind. One, you work as an employee, you work as a worker, you work as a self-employed individual. The employee could be part-time or full-time. Employee could be on contract. Employee, sometimes you also see the government has introduced apprenticeships way back in 2016. So you can, as an organization, as a company, hire an apprenticeship. You could also have people working with you as volunteers. Sometimes we do have teachers who are doing teacher training. They come into us and obviously volunteer in terms of gaining experience within the organization in terms of teaching and related services. So you could have somebody work, on that aspect in terms of different types of employment as a volunteer as well. So I will go across and we'll cover some of these in a bit more detail. But just from a definition point of view, what is an employee? This is something that, we take it for granted. But if you were to ask yourself a quick question, then what is an employee? A person who's hired for work for another, hired for work by a business or a firm in return for some sort of commercial payment or transaction would be termed as a work employee. A worker would be a person engaged in employment or some sort of, labor work. So labor work. Now, when we do talk about workers, we can classify them. It's a generic term. We can classify workers who pretty much work on a daily basis, on a contract basis, on a weekly basis, on an hourly basis. And here the difference tends to be, looking at calling them a worker. And workers can perform or can be asked to perform a variety of tasks depending on, their skill set and obviously the compensation that they would like to receive in exchange for, obviously completing that part of the role. Now, there are people who can also be classed as self-employed. A self-employed person would be a person who's actually running their own business and in some cases is responsible for more than one activity happening within the business or within a particular set of an organization. Self-employed people generally would need to have some sort of an outsourced HR or, maybe depending on the size of the business, they might have, somebody working and looking after HR side of things, which would look at protecting the rights of workers, even for the director or the owner of the company himself. And then self-employed people have flexibility in terms of their work schedule because they are not bound by the standard routines or job or employment contracts which are issued by the organization. For example, people who work as plumbers, electricians, or you work as a dentist, or if you work in your own business, typically some of these people could be working as self-employed, and these self-employed people have flexibility in terms of their work schedules, the day they want to work, or the time and the hours they want to work. And obviously, in some cases, the reverse aspect of it is, or a disadvantage of this is that they might not have a specific job, or in some cases they might also have inconsistent methods through which they earn income. That means their income streams would be, as against an employed, as against an employer, as against an employer or as a worker who works for a company, they would get paid at the end of the month. In the case of self-employed people, you would generally see that they do not sometimes have structured form of income. They can obviously withdraw income from the company at any given point in time, but that gives them inconsistency in terms of having an income or an income stream. There can be other definitions, but these are very literal definitions of how would I class, or talk about different types of employment. Now, if I were to get into a more detailed discussion to look at different types of employment statuses in the UK, there could be very many. And this table that I've put up, essentially on the screen covers some basic types, giving you some examples of what are the various types of employments and employment statuses that are possible in the UK. So as I've talked about employee, an individual with a contract for employment who works for a specific employer. You might have one job, you might have two jobs, but essentially you're working for somebody, and in return you get payments or wages at the end of the month. You're entitled to, obviously, if you're working, depending on the status of your working, whether you're a full-time or a part-time employee, if you're on a contract or a 0 hours contract, but some of these rights and responsibilities would still apply to you as a worker because you're working for an organization or a business. And in this case, they would constitute what is called the employment rights. So things like sick pay, maternity pay, paternity pay, holiday pay, national holidays, pension in some cases because of the Pensions Act, which was brought in by the government in 2017. All employers are mandatorily required to pay pension contributions of up to 3%. Which is driven to, I think, 5% now, if people are working on a contract or some sort of contracted employment with a business or an organization. And then obviously you work through a schedule, you work a number of hours, depending on if you're on a part-time contract, a full-time contract. A full-time contract in the UK is just generally 37.5 hours, a week. Anything over that time would constitute either overtime or time which would have to be approved by your employer for additional work, and it is then paid separately. Now, here the example of employee would be office workers, retail staff, teachers, people who work in the bank or any sort of an organization, private or public sector organization, wherein they're employed and working for somebody. I mean, when I say somebody, I mean an employer, an organization, a business. They would be classed as employees. Now, worker is person who basically works under a contract. So, but you have fewer rights than employees. That is the main difference between a worker and an employee. So a worker could be a contractual worker, somebody who's working on a temporary contract, somebody who's working on a fixed time contract. They would be classed as workers because they would not have the full rights as available to a full-time employee. Now, if you look at large firms like PwC, Ernst & Young, you look at KPMG, you look at some of the other sets of businesses like financial businesses, IT businesses, they employ a lot of workers which would come in and work on a contract. That means they would come in and work on a project for 2 months, 3 months, 2 days, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 years, but they would not be classed as a full-time employee because their contract would only entitle them to work a certain number of hours, and they would be required to work on a particular project, particular responsibility, and that is why they would be classed as workers. Now, they are entitled to minimum wage, paid holidays, and obviously, other employment benefits that would have been discussed and agreed between the employer and the contractor or the worker in this case, and that would be, applicable to them as under the employment law. Now, these typical examples, people who work as a worker could be 0-hour contract workers, agency workers, supply staff. Sometimes when you work through an agency for an employer, then you would be classed as a worker because you're working through an agency to cover, say, for example, a staff who's called in sick. To give you an example, as a college, we do have contracts with certain agencies, right, like Randstad and some of the others in the UK, in Manchester in particular. And obviously what happens is if one of our teachers calls in sick and there's a class which is supposed to happen at a short notice, we are able to arrange a supply teacher who can come in and obviously, fill in that particular vacancy for that day. And that allows us to tag along and obviously, ensure that learners are not disadvantaged as per their timetable when they come in to study on a particular day. So in such cases, people who come in through the agency and cover a particular class for a day or so, or day or 2 days, because the permanent employee or an employee in this case is taken sick or ill, then in such cases they would be classed as workers. We'd pay an agency contract, have an agency contract in place. We'll pay the agency worker a standard contract pay, which has been agreed between us and the agency, and they would then come in and cover that particular role or that particular day on that particular contract, and they will be classed as workers, but they are not employees of our company. And in such cases, they are employed through an agency, and they would then get temporary work or temporary wage or pay, depending on what work they've been offered, to cover on a particular day by a college like ours or somebody else in a different training company, just as an example. We talk about self-employed. Self-employed tends to be, people or workers who are running their own businesses. They're responsible for their own, payroll, for example, they have their own obligations in terms of fulfilling some of the key parts related to government regulation and some of the bits which are related to employment law. They would obviously, in some cases, not have any employment rights because they run and work for themselves. In most cases, you would also look at that sometimes when you have people which are employed on a self-employed basis, they have to sign a declaration which basically says that I'm responsible for my own taxes, because they raise an invoice to the company or the organization. And in such cases, you would generally see that they are mandatorily required to do their own PAYE returns at the end of the year with HMRC, and in such cases, they would be termed as self-employed. These people could be consultants, freelancers, small business owners, which have set up their own businesses to be able to offer services which are dependent on them alone. And because of their skill set and the experience they have, they're able to offer these services without taking any additional support from other people. So a plumber, an electrician, a dentist, for example, a consultant working within quality or offering certain services related to education, they might be termed as, free self-employed individuals, which, work for themselves on a contractual basis. You have agency workers. I've given you an example there as well. So agency workers are workers which work through a recruitment agency, but they sometimes perform different work for different clients. So if you're registered with Randstad in the education sector, or if you're registered, say for example, as a plumber with a firm in Manchester, like Manchester Plumbing Supplies and Supplies, they have maybe hundreds of plumbers who work with them, and when they do get a call, they would then assign that job to a particular plumber in that area, which is where you are based. And in such cases, they will pay you for the services, because they tend to act as the central agency or contractual agency which covers and gets these calls. But in the end, they pass it on to you or outsource it to you, and you work with them to be able to provide these services. And in return, you get your entitlement of your services, which is, say, for example, your daily wage, or in this case, the wage or the work, the pay that you get in exchange for the work that you do, in order to, look at the work being assigned by the agency. Now, they have the same entitlement, but obviously what you will generally see is that agency workers, after working, if you work continuously for an employer or a particular organization for 12 weeks or more, then the agency worker is bound to be offered a contract by the organization, because you're essentially, working through an agency, but you're working with the same employer. And in such cases, there are, contractual obligations as per the employment law which need to be fulfilled, and you would then need to work or be offered a contract from the organization themselves. Now, these people are generally classed as temporary workers, or event staff, or people who are working on contracts. A simple example that I would give you is, in the UK, you have lots of these football matches and games which typically happen in the Premier League, in the second league, in the third league. Basically, on a big match yesterday, which was between Manchester City and Real Madrid, you would have an attendance in the Etihad Stadium of, say, 55, 60,000 people. You would generally employ a lot of contractual staff or agencies which basically provide volunteers and security personnel for that particular day, for the match of the day. And in such cases, that is to primarily look at organizing the entry and exit points, and looking at ensuring health and safety. People who then get involved or get called in from the agencies which have a contract with Manchester United or Manchester City, or in this case, or Etihad Stadium, would typically send trained people across who will be working on the basis of working on behalf of the agency as agency workers, obviously guiding people into the stands and obviously making sure health and safety and some of the other compliances are met. And they would be classed as what are called temporary workers or event staff for that particular day, match of the day, and that will be classed as event staff. I also mentioned to you different types of under different types of employment status, apprentices. So government started the apprenticeship program, I think way back in 2016. Obviously, it has been, functional in some shape or form when we look at, previous years as well. But one of the ways through which you can also employ staff within the organization as an apprentice. Apprentice would typically combine, would be somebody classed as who's actually working within the organization and studying and also trying to gain experience, which is like a bit of on-job training. And here the apprenticeship cess or the levy, which is the employer's levy, is used to pay for the apprenticeship wages. So 5% of employer cess the contribution is done by the employer, which is 5%, and 95% comes in from the government, which allows organizations to take up people on job in terms of training. And they are then also doing two aspects of it. One, they're training, obviously learning within the job, and they're also doing a course, which is to gain a formal qualification. They will also have the same entitlement as employees. They will have obviously apprenticeship wages, which are defined in the apprenticeship wage structure in the UK. And these apprenticeships could be in various fields: management, plumbing, electrical, engineering, IT, and there are loads of areas. Then you have interns and work placements, which are primarily for students who are looking at gaining experience. If I remember my old days when I was, in uni and doing my MBA, I was required to do a summer placement with an organization to carry out a project, and that was a practical project, and for which I had to approach various organizations to take me on as a intern or allow me to carry out my work placement, which was for 6 weeks. And in return, sometimes organizations pay you a bit of a stipend or some sort of a dividend, or some, not dividend, essentially some sort of a stipend or a pay in return, and that is because you're working with them for a particular project, or you're working within that organization as an intern. You generally see that happening in most industries: hotel industry, shipping industry, airline industry. You look at IT industry, and a lot of people who are completing their degree courses, or essentially their some sort of a course, can apply to various organizations to work as interns or as job trainees or on-job trainees, and they in return are looking at carrying out a particular project or a bit of work, which will be the practical aspect of the requirements that they are required to complete as a part of their study or as their project. So here, your rights would depend on whether they've been defined in the contract or in the work placement. And in general, most interns or work placements, job placements or work placements essentially do entitle you for a bit of a stipend. And in this case, it is mostly facilitated by universities and colleges. And we generally see these internships happening within engineering, as I mentioned, different fields, but it could be within various fields depending on what you're actually studying and what does your university or your college actually facilitate. You look at director, volunteer, and casual seasonal worker. So director is person who's somebody who's the owner of the company, or the managing director, or the person who's actually directing the operations of the company. On the company's house, the person is registered as a director. The person could be self-employed, working as a director within his own registered company, or in some cases, having registered a company as a director, but working as an employee within the company. So here, the director would have the same rights as the employees, and they would essentially be also bound by various employment legislation as a normal employee would do, provided you're working as an employee within, as an employee or as a director within your own business. Volunteers tend to be essentially people who provide services, without expectation of any payments or any stipends. Generally, as I mentioned to you earlier, as an example, we do get teachers, from different places like Southport, University of Chester, some of the other areas in universities which are doing the teaching qualification or postgraduate certificate in education. and they need to gain some experience of working as a teacher by practically getting aligned to a particular organization or a teaching organization where they're able to offer these teaching services as a volunteer in order to gain experience and practice, and they would be termed as volunteers. Now, obviously, there is no formal contract of employment here, but they would still be protected by certain laws and legislations, things like the Equality and Diversity Act, inclusion, looking at Inclusion Act, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, looking at Discrimination Act, looking at the Data Protection Act. And in such cases, the organizations are not obliged to pay any stipend or any fees to people who would work for the purposes of gaining experience within the organization or a particular set of business, and they would be classed as what are called volunteers. Casual or seasonal workers tend to be people who work on an ad hoc basis. They have no guaranteed hours in terms of work. They're entitled to minimum wage as per the UK employment law. They obviously are eligible to get paid holidays, and their work can fluctuate depending on the demand of work within the organization or the business that they work for. These seasonal workers tend to be workers which work mostly within the hospitality sector. You generally see during the Christmas period in the UK, there is a demand for casual workers, or sometimes you would see because of increased demand in terms of sales or the festive periods, organizations would take up casual workers which will work for a certain number of hours across certain days, and they would be termed as casual oblique seasonal workers. So I hope this particular session has provided you detailed insight into various types of employment status that we want to look at in terms of learning outcome 1. Now, I have detailed some of these out in the subsequent presentation slides, which I would expect you to go through, and they would essentially be useful for you to understand the context of the learning outcome 1, different types of employment status in a great amount of detail. Some of these slides, some of the bits that I've covered, information that I've shared is also covered in these slides, and it will be useful for you to undergo, in your own time, read some of these slides to crystallize, the information that we've discussed in today's lecture. Now, if you have any questions related to the discussion that we've done today, my suggestion would be to ask me now, or you can, if you think of them at a later stage, you can also send me an email, and that would be through to this email address. Just let me bring that on. And this email address, which is learnerwork, at ukversity.co.uk. Now, there is a particular book which is on employment law, which is also uploaded on Moodle. And this particular book on employment law is actually an extract of the company's employee handbook, which basically gives you a practical input in terms of understanding how these are implemented, the discussion that we've done in terms of different status of workers, how they are implemented, and obviously interpreted within the employee handbook for an organization. And that would be a good read for you to do along with going through these slides that I've got in this particular presentation. So if there are no questions today, then I'd like to end this session here, and I will see you in the next one, wherein we'll be essentially picking up and starting to discuss learning outcome 2, which talks about understanding the laws relating to the contracts of employment. So take care and see you in the next session. Bye for now.